Our next session is on the Coast Guard and how the Coast Guard is a unique instrument of national security, and we have the perfect person to do that and the perfect person to introduce the conversation as well. So I'm going to, and I love this help I'm getting this year, I'm going to hand it over to Cadet First Class Mary Mergott. She's a regimental commander at the Coast Guard Academy. She runs marathons. Like I guess if you're in the marathon club, it means you run marathons, right? And she founded something called the Spartan Club. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball. I wanted to do the introduction and get this whole session going as people file in. But I don't know what a Spartan Club is. She founded it. It sounds like something that would probably be too tough for me, but I want to know a little bit more about. So over to you.
Good morning. Admiral Kevin Lunday assumed the duties as the 34th Vice Commandant on June 13, 2024. As the Vice Service Chief, he advances and executes the Commandant's strategic vision and intent, directs internal organizational governance, serves as the component acquisition executive, and oversees the readiness and modernization of the force, ensuring the Coast Guard of 57,000 women and men remain semper paratus, always ready to serve the American people. During his 37 years of service, Admiral Lunday has served and commanded in operations, intelligence, national security, legal, and mission support assistance. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Lunday.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm joined by our team from Coast Guard headquarters and coming up from Washington, D.C., and I'm also honored to be joined by my lovely wife, Linda Lee, who's here. And I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and all of the World Affairs groups that have dialed in virtually to participate in today's events. I'd like to also thank Ms. Torrey for her and the team here for putting on such a fantastic event. We have a lot of distinguished folks here today. Ambassador Wynne Stanley is here. I know General Ashley just spoke with General Buzza and gave a very powerful talk on the threats that the U.S. and our allies are facing. Very important, and some great recommendations from General Ashley there as well. So I also want to recognize, in addition to all of our attendees here, we have allies that are here. Can I have a show of hands from our U.S. allies that are in the room and our international partners, just so we can recognize? Thank you.
The non-Americans.
The non-Americans. Thank you. And then I also want to recognize the most distinguished talent we have in the room and out there online. The most distinguished talent. And it's not the people who look older like me, or General Ashley, or General Buzza, or Mr. Sanger. It's the young people. It's our students, our cadets from the Coast Guard Academy, our cadets from West Point that are here, our ROTC cadets and midshipmen who are dialing in or maybe here in the room. It's our high school students. I understand we might have some high school students listening in. See, you're distinguished because you are the future. And whether you choose to serve in public service in the government or in the military, at the federal level or in state or local government, whether you choose to serve in industry or commerce, you are contributing and making a difference, and that potential to do that is ahead of you. And so you are distinguishable, or you are distinguished for your talent and the potential that you have. And so thank you for participating in today's event and in this session specifically. Now, in the next 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is talk about three things with you. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is about the Coast Guard, because some people may know a little bit about the Coast Guard. Maybe you got saved by the Coast Guard, or you got boarded and we cited you for not having life jackets on your boat. But I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the Coast Guard. Second thing I want to do is talk about our partnerships and the power of partnerships for the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard is actually a global organization that works with allies and international partners every single day, and we'll talk about that. And the third thing I want to talk about briefly is why is that important? Why is that important? So let me start with the Coast Guard. How many folks have seen or listened to the music from the musical, the Broadway award-winning musical, Hamilton? Right? Awesome. A lot of people have done that, right? And so in there's a song called the Adams Administration. That's about as much singing as I'm going to do. How many people remember that song, the Adams Administration? If you listen really closely, you can hear the Coast Guard mentioned briefly in that song. Why is that? That's because Alexander Hamilton is the father of the Coast Guard. See, back at the beginning of our time as a young republic, right after the Revolutionary War, the United States was deeply in debt. We had disbanded the U.S. Navy, the Continental Navy, because we had a fear of standing armies and navies from our time from the Revolutionary War. And so we did not have a way to collect commerce. And we're a maritime nation, we needed trade. And so Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, realized that we needed to have a series of vessels that would enforce U.S. sovereignty of the young republic, collect revenue, and then prevent smuggling, and be our defense because we didn't have a navy anymore. We would not recreate that until 1798. And so Alexander Hamilton said he wrote a letter and he said, a few armed vessels judiciously stationed at the entrances of our ports might at some small expense make themselves useful sentinels of the law. Sentinels of the law. And then a law was passed and then the young nation built 10 revenue marine cutters and they began to operate. One of them was actually commanded by a young officer from Connecticut, John Maltby, who had served in the Continental Navy, and he commanded the revenue cutter Argus, one of the first 10. Now his namesake continues. We just launched the brand new offshore patrol cutter Argus last year, and another year it will be operating in the fleet. So Connecticut has a strong connection, not just with the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in New London, but our history. And so that was 1790. And then what began to happen is that over time, the U.S. government began to add functions and responsibilities to this young revenue cutter service. The U.S. Lighthouse Service, the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which started in Massachusetts. And then over time, as propulsion began to be modernized in shipping, the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation was added. In 1915, the modern term U.S. Coast Guard was created, and then we have continued to grow since then. Now, we've been in different places as an agency. We started in Treasury during World War I and World War II. We were under the Department of War, under the Department of Transportation, and then the last 20 years we've been in Homeland Security. So today the Coast Guard is 57,000 people strong, and we operate around, not only in the United States, but around the world. And we have a range of missions. In fact, what makes the Coast Guard unique is that we are a multi-mission agency with broad authorities. And even though we're not very large, still just a little bit larger than the New York City Police Department, we have a lot of capability. And we perform roles that no one else does that provides unique value to the nation. Let me talk a little bit about how we do that here at home. And when I say at home, in the homeland, I mean the United States, not only the continental U.S., but certainly Alaska, Hawaii, our 3 territories in the Pacific, Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa, and 2 territories in the Caribbean. All of that is U.S. territory that we have responsibility as a maritime nation to ensure our security, and then the safety, security, environmental protection, and operations of our ports and waterways. So every day, or every year, $5.4 trillion of goods travel in and out of our ports and waterways, not just along the coast, through the inland waterways and navigable waterways and the Great Lakes. And every product that you touch or use or buy, 90% of those came either to the U.S. or is leaving as a good or a product through our marine transportation system. And so it's vital to our economic prosperity and our national security. But the Coast Guard also operates around the world. We have larger cutters and we have people and teams that are stationed throughout the world. Why is that? Well, the U.S. depends on a system of global trade and commerce and our relationships throughout the world. And so the Coast Guard's responsibilities connect to our partners that are around the world. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. And so today the Coast Guard operates boats, ships we call cutters, boats, aircraft, and small deployable teams that operate here in the U.S. and around the world. Now, you may be very familiar with the very distinctive Coast Guard, white-hulled cutters with the blue and red racing stripe and the Coast Guard seal. But those aren't Coast Guard cutters because we paint them that way. They're cutters because of our people, the extraordinary young men and women who step forward to serve in the United States Coast Guard. A Coast Guard that today, although we sit in the Department of Homeland Security, from the beginning for the last 234 years, we've been a military service. We're one of the 6th armed forces in the United States, but we sit in DHS. But every day we are fully integrated with the rest of the joint force. And that's part of what makes us unique. So let me go to the second thing, the power of partnerships with our allies and those nations that share our values. Now, we've talked a little bit about today, and we'll continue to talk about in the course of today's events, the importance of the rules-based international order and framework. And it's good to sort of review in our history where that comes from. And a lot of it is grounded really in maritime roots. I mean, there are a lot of sources of that, but one of the sources, history tells us, was a Dutchman named Hugo Grotius in the early 1600s. He was a lawyer, philosopher, and he wrote several treatises and a book called Mare Liberum on the freedom of the seas, this idea of the freedom of navigation. And a lot of his original ideas actually informed the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which created the modern concept of a nation-state system, of states that had their independent sovereignty and that interacted with one another in an international system. Now, if we move forward in time, post-World War II, General Ashley talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement. We know about the UN Charter and the creation of the United Nations that began to set in place a framework of multilateral arrangements and frameworks. And that framework, along with our bilateral agreements for the United States and for our allies and other nations, they have been the guarantee, mostly the guarantor, of our freedom, peace, and stability and prosperity for the last 79 years, since the end of World War II. Inside the international framework under the UN Charter of multilateral agreements, of the UN Charter, there are other agreements that we rely on every day in the U.S. Coast Guard to enable the functioning of commerce and ensure the safety and security of shipping and of our port facilities that enables trade and enables the United States and other nations to be able to be prosperous. So, for example, the International Maritime Organization is a body of the United Nations. The U.S. Coast Guard, along with the Department of State, leads the U.S. delegation to the IMO, and over the last 70 years has created a body of international frameworks that govern shipping every day. And it's vital to the operation of our global trade system. International conventions that ensure the safety of those ships, that every mariner that operates on any commercial ship meets certain standards for training and certification, that every ship follows international conventions on the prevention of pollution from those ships, that they follow conventions regarding the safety of life at sea. So all of that is an essential part of the framework that enables our economy and other economies to operate. In addition to these multilateral agreements, the U.S. is, of course, engaged in a series of bilateral agreements. And the Coast Guard is part of that framework. Today, the U.S. Coast Guard is part of over 60 multilateral and bilateral agreements that we use every day. What's that look like? Today, down in the U.S. Southern Command area of responsibility in the Eastern Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, the Coast Guard and the Department of Defense and other DHS components are hard at work stopping the flow of illegal drugs toward the United States. Now, if a Coast Guard cutter comes upon a vessel at sea and it's flying the flags of another nation, we have conventions and agreements with most nations that operate in that area under the Vienna Convention to be able to confirm the registry of that and flag of that vessel, or that it has none, and then be able to conduct enforcement if that vessel is engaged in illicit activity. Another example, a foreign flag commercial vessel, container ship, maybe 200 a day come into U.S. ports. If it's foreign flag, it's subject to our laws and regulations, but it's also subject to international conventions, and the Coast Guard goes on board to ensure their compliance with international safety, security, and pollution regulations and conventions. If we think about how this happens more broadly, our partnerships happen because first, we go out in the Coast Guard and we travel around the world to connect with people. We send out training teams to build capacity and partnership throughout the world on issues of maritime governance, whether it's safety or security or pollution or emergency response. And we invite international partners and allies into the United States to learn and work with us and exchange information and capacity for us as well. So at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy down in London, Connecticut, a 4-year program, much like the other military service academies. I happen to believe it's the best one, since I'm a product of that institution as well. But although my brother and his wife are both graduates from West Point, so we have a bit of a struggle in the family. But every year we have, let's see, how many do we have? 23 students from 12 different nations that are enrolled in the Coast Guard Academy. At our International Maritime Officer course down at Yorktown, Virginia, 123 students from 42 different nations. And then we post our Coast Guard officers and personnel around the country. And you would be amazed to find Coast Guard officers permanently based in Vietnam, in Malta, in the Philippines, in places like Liberia or Kenya, Gabon, where we reach out and connect and advance the U.S. mission in those countries under the ambassador's authority. What makes this effective is, yes, we need those international agreements, whether they're multilateral or bilateral, and those are made between nation states. And there are forums where the states gather together, like the Arctic Council or NATO, certainly, and they bind themselves together by shared common purpose. But what makes them work, and I'm coming back to people again, is the interaction between individuals, between people that represent their nations. That connective tissue is actually what breathes life into it. The multilateral agreements set the table. It is you and I that sit down at that table that make those partnerships work. Why is that? It's because individuals build trust, organizations don't. It's individuals that build trust by our common connection to one another, by a finding of shared common ground and common values. And at that's one of the things the Coast Guard has a unique value for, and one of the reasons that we're a global Coast Guard in increasing demand. Let me get to the why, and then I look forward to your questions. Why is this important? The National Security Strategy of the United States. In that document, and General Ashley and General Buzza talked a little bit about it this morning, but in that document, the President states that this is the decisive decade for the United States and our allies. And in this decisive decade, the actions that we take will determine whether or not the international rules and the international order that has been the guarantee of our security and our economic prosperity for the last 79 years, whether that will prevail. Whether that will prevail. And not just in the sense of strategic competition, but other challenges that we face together. The significant and growing impacts of a changing climate. And that's not it is a scientific discussion, but I'm not a climate scientist. But I see the operational impacts of that happening in real time, and we can talk more about that. The acceleration and convergence of technology in the logical and the physical domains that are bringing remarkable changes at a blinding speed. And an increase in human insecurity brought on by pandemics, brought on by war, and food insecurity that is creating movement and migration of massive numbers of people, and it's not stopping. And so there are a lot of common challenges that we face, and they seem very daunting. Now, the historian Paul Johnson, in his book on the history of the 20th century called Modern Times, he has a great quote in there. He says, "There are no inevitabilities in history. There are no inevitabilities in history." And the reason that's important is because the history that goes forward, well, that's up to us to define that history. And I know as we look at the challenges that we face together, it can be very daunting. It can be daunting, and it's easy to get discouraged. But if you look back in history, what you find is that these types of challenges are not new to the United States or to our allies or partners. They're just new to us at this time. At this time. Now, how many mariners do I have in the room? People that have sailed on the water or like to be on the water? My Coast Guard Academy cadets all better raise their hand. Well, if you're a mariner and you're out at sea, it's not uncommon to be caught in a storm. And when you're in that storm, it's easy for fear to creep in and you to get discouraged. And the most important thing is that you have to have courage in the strength of your crew and the strength of your team. Where does the United States draw our strength from to face these storms? First, we draw it from our values as Americans, values that are enshrined in our Constitution. We know we're not perfect, but the language in the preamble, in order to form a more perfect union, means that we are continually pursuing an ideal. That is the source of strength in our values and the ideal that we're pursuing. The second source of our strength is the strength of our allies and partnerships. Those who have a shared values and ideals that we do. Yes, we are a nation state, distinct from other nation states, even that are allies and partners. But the United States cannot succeed without the strength in multilateral arrangements like NATO and other arrangements, or in bilateral agreements, without a shared bonding with our allies and partners. And so as we look to weather these storms laid out in the national security strategy that we're talking about today, it's important that we have courage. It's also important that we have hope. And as I look at the young people here, and I get a chance to talk to them, who will lead us into the future against these shared challenges, I have a certain hope for the future of the United States and the future with our allies and partners to continue our values and our way of life. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Mary, would you join me up front?
Good morning, Admiral. I can kick it off with the first question, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Okay.
So you spoke of the increasing demand of the Coast Guard. Through your 37 years of service, how have you seen the Coast Guard expand or adapt to meet and exceed the expectations that the world has of us?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I mentioned the Coast Guard has grown over time and evolved as we are really a mosaic of different agencies that were sort of bolted on over the last 234 years. And so really part of our culture as an organization is to be adaptable. And so being moved between Treasury and Defense or Department of War and transportation and now Homeland Security means we've had to adapt at different times to different changes in what the nation demanded of the Coast Guard. And we see that our mission has also evolved as well. Certainly in the post-9/11 environment, security became much more paramount. But we have had to adapt not only in our security type and safety missions, but also in our military missions, just as the rest of the U.S. Armed Forces have. Well, what does that look like? So the U.S. Coast Guard has a U.S. Cyber Command. It's actually a component of, it has a Coast Guard Cyber Command that's a component of U.S. Cyber Command. And so we conduct operations, and our personnel and teams are trained in the same joint standards as all of the other services that operate under U.S. Cyber Command. But because we're in Homeland Security, we've evolved to be actually be able to work on U.S. critical infrastructure and maritime transportation system and other sectors to be able to perform duties that other armed forces are not able to perform because we are able to operate within Homeland Security as restrictions they don't. And so when I commanded Coast Guard Cyber, I think we started with about 100 people. Today it's over 500 in a very short time because the demand for us to scale that capability and bring the unique authorities and capabilities the Coast Guard has to protect critical infrastructure and operate with the Joint Force is one area where we've made significant progress and change.
Thank you, Admiral. We have questions from the audience. Yes. We got
I'm sorry, Mary, you're the moderator, not me.
over here.
Good morning, Admiral. Good morning, Admiral. Third class Daniel Corbello from the Coast Guard Academy. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us this morning. Sorry. Admiral Lunday, we see the U.S. is a maritime nation, one of the strongest in the world. We also see we are slipping from that top position as China is producing a ship almost every 4 months. It takes America almost a decade to produce one icebreaker that is very needed. The words maritime shows up about 4 times in the 2022 National Security Strategy. The word ship comes up 0. Do you believe investing in the maritime industry should be a higher priority for national security? And if so, how would that look for you? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great question. So I mentioned the 10 original revenue cutters that were built starting in 1790. They were all built in U.S. shipyards by U.S. craftsmen, tradesmen, and laborers that produced those ships, and our Coast Guard cutters have been since then. We are struggling with a defense industrial base and a shipbuilding industry that needs to be much more robust than it is now. Those shipbuilders, for the U.S. Navy and for the Coast Guard and our commercial U.S. fleet, are struggling to get the number of workers needed to move at the capacity that the United States needs. But they are working on it, and it's taking time for us to move faster. We've already, Daniel, you asked about icebreakers, and we are building the next generation of icebreakers in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard operates the nation's only icebreakers for the polar, assuring access to our polar regions. We have two, the heavy icebreaker that's 48 years old, the Polar Star, and then the 24-year-old Coast Guard cutter Healy, which goes to the Arctic North every year. We're building the new Polar Security Cutter. It's now running over budget and behind schedule, which is basically any shipbuilding program in the United States right now, because as hard as, and we have a strong, robust core, but we don't have the capacity, and they're struggling to train the workers and some of the skills and technology to weld steel that thick for an icebreaker. It's almost 1.5 inches thick. That's specialized knowledge that doesn't exist since we haven't built an icebreaker in 24 years. And so it's taking time to rebuild that capacity. What we've realized is we need to not try and do it alone. And so during the week of the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., I think this was in July, late July, there was an announcement of a new tri-party agreement between the U.S., Finland, and Canada called the ICE Pact, the Icebreaker Collaboration Effort Pact. And what it would do was enable the sharing of information, knowledge, technology between Finland, Canada, and the United States so that we could more rapidly build icebreakers as three nations together rather than each doing it on our own. So that's just been announced. We're working hard to move forward into that. But what we realize is we have a way to go. Now, there is not that we haven't had success. The ships that the U.S. yards are producing, the new cutters that have been produced for the last 15 plus years, the quality is remarkable. They are our 154-foot fast response cutters are operating with capabilities far beyond what we envisioned they would, which is great. But we also see success in the civilian fleet. Congress has appropriated money for the construction of new training vessels at each of the state maritime academies. Now, those vessels will not only train future U.S. mariners at those state maritime academies, they're also going to be part of MARAD's ready fleet in the event of needed mobilization. And the quality of those ships being built in the Philadelphia shipyard is very high quality. So thanks for the question, Daniel. I think we had a question over here, Matt.
I had a question right over there.
Joe Baxter, United Nations Association of Connecticut. I'm wondering what the consequence may be for the Coast Guard that the U.S. has not signed the Convention of the Sea with the United Nations and other nations. And secondly, how might that affect the engagement of the Coast Guard and the U.S. In the South China Sea?
Great, sir. Thank you for the question. So the U.S. position on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is that it is binding customary international law, binding on all nations. And so that is how we diplomatically, militarily, operationally, how we view that. It's customary international law. The U.S. has not acceded fully to the treaty. That's a decision at the political level by the Senate. And so I'll leave that because we don't do politics in the military. But in terms of the effectiveness, no, I would tell you that I've been to Pacific Island Forum meetings where the representative from the People's Republic of China was whacking us over the head in front of Pacific Island nation partners because we were not fully a member, had not fully acceded. And so it's a challenge for the United States at times. We get challenged on it. But in terms of its effectiveness, it is binding customary international law to every day, and we rely on it every day. Yes.
Hi, my name is Fahim. I am an international student from Bangladesh at Springfield College. Former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, she said that US has been trying to secure a military base at Saint Martin Island, which is very close to the Bay of Bengal, to counter the Chinese dominance in Bay of Bengal. So many people in Bangladesh thinks that the potential establishment of military base will violate the sovereignty of Bangladesh. So how are you going to assure Bangladeshi that this potential military base will respect the sovereignty and autonomy of Bangladesh? Thank you.
Fahim, thank you very much for your question. I actually am not familiar with that issue, and so I don't know the history of it or the U.S. position on it. And so I appreciate you raising it. I'm going to go back and ask some questions about it, but I don't know the specific project that you're talking about. But thanks for asking about it.
Good morning. My name is Naseem, and I'm with the World Affairs Councils of America, headquartered in D.C., and its affiliate in Orange County, California. And my question somewhat expands on this gentleman's question. How is the U.S. Coast Guard responding to the strategic maneuvers of Russia and China in the Arctic, particularly given their near proximity to Alaska? Thank you.
Naseem, thank you very much for the question. So we've talked about today about the U.S. as a maritime nation. The U.S. is also an Arctic nation because Alaska is the 49th state is above the Arctic Circle, and so we're one of the Arctic nations. And so we have sovereignty and responsibilities in the Arctic. And so what we see, there is a multilateral framework for the Arctic in a couple of different ways. First of all, under the UN auspices, there are international conventions for pollution prevention, safety of life at sea, in the Polar Code, and then there's also the Arctic Council, which is a collective group of the Arctic nations that are supposed to work together on areas of common concern, although that hasn't been working since the unchecked aggression by Russia against Ukraine, where they have not been participating in the Arctic Council. So we actually interact with, or we engage with, in terms of seeing each other and responding, with the PLA Navy, that's Chinese Navy, and with Russian Navy as well. This Sunday was an example. In the Bering Strait, surface action group of 3 Russian naval vessels was transiting south in the Bering. So it was a surface warship, a submarine, and a tug, a military tug, and they crossed over into the U.S. exclusive economic zone in the Bering Strait, which is the 200-mile edge of our exclusive economic zone. Now that's allowed under international law, but it's important that when they operate there, they understand that the U.S. is ensuring our sovereignty by being present as well, by engaging them, communicating with them, challenging them as to their intentions, and ensuring that their behavior is consistent with customary international law. And so that just took place Sunday. And then there was, we also conducted probably last month an overflight of a PRC research vessel that was loitering just outside the limit of our exclusive economic zone in the Chukchi Sea north of Alaska, right in the area where the United States has asserted a new claim over the U.S. outer continental shelf. And so we are seeing increased activity by Russia, which is an Arctic nation, by China, and the PRC is not an Arctic nation. They call themselves a near Arctic nation, which is sort of it's a made-up term. There isn't such a thing. But they're operating with significantly more presence in the Arctic. And so the U.S. position is that we expect all nations that are operating up there to do so responsibly and display responsible state behavior. And as we see increased activity in the Arctic, it is a new maritime frontier because it's an ocean, and the ice is continually shifting and the ice coverage is diminishing. And that means there's increased human activity, increased commerce, potential increased commerce through the Northern Sea Route, which is north of the Russian coast, through the Trans-Arctic Route, and the Northwest Passage, which borders much closer and along the northern border of Canada. And so we can expect greater human activity. And where there's human activity in the Arctic, there is a need for sovereign states, Arctic nations, to be there and ensure maritime governance. And that's what the U.S. Coast Guard's doing. Thanks, Nassim.
Admiral Lunday, Cadet Logan Quinones from West Point. As the United States combats drugs coming from abroad to our ports, how does the Coast Guard work with our international partners in order to combat drug trafficking? And how can the United States and its partners improve its strategy in combating this issue?
Great. Thank you very much for the question. I had the opportunity to testify before a congressional committee yesterday on this very topic, and I got a lot of questions. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. I got a lot of questions, but your question was the best one. I wish they would have asked that one. Drugs coming into the United States is a national problem for the United States. And while we have seen a gradual increase in the number, we have seen a significant increase in the number of synthetic drugs that are coming to the United States, like fentanyl and other synthetic-based drugs. They have surpassed cocaine as the #1 cause of death of Americans. And so they bring crime, death, and destruction into U.S. communities. And so it's important that we work under the U.S. National Drug Control Strategy, which is not only a demand reduction strategy, but also a supply reduction. And the Coast Guard's efforts are on the supply reduction through interdiction. That we work not only within the U.S. interagency, but that we work with international partners. Because these transnational criminal organizations, the cartels that engage in this vast criminal enterprise, they are well funded, they are powerful, and it requires the U.S. to work in conjunction with our partners in Central and South America, and with our allies that also work in this region. The United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Canada, that operate because these are also shared threats for those nations. And so we talked about some of the international agreements where we work together. But let me give you a specific example. Coming out of South America toward the Dutch territories in the Caribbean Ocean is a significant flow of drugs coming out of Venezuela. And so a Dutch ship operating under Dutch authority is on patrol. And on that Dutch ship is a U.S. Coast Guard law enforcement detachment with our capability and our authority. And we work very closely with the Dutch, and we do this with our other major allies when they have surface assets present. And then we do that under the authority of the Coast Guard and the Department of Defense, depending on the phase of the mission it is, to interdict and stop the flow of drugs, and then bring those actors to trial, whether it's in Dutch territory, under Dutch authority, or U.S. territory. And then we also not only disrupt the activities of these cartels, but we generate information that enables us to interrupt or disrupt their ability to sow instability in Central and South America, which also places pressure on the U.S. border because it drives human insecurity and migration. Thanks for the question.
Admiral, I think that's all the time we have for questions today.
I think it is. I'd just like to finish by saying thank you for the opportunity to be here today representing the U.S. Coast Guard. What I would encourage you to do, if you really want to know about what's special about the Coast Guard, please come talk to our young cadets who are here from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. And I want to thank Regimental Commander Mergott from Berlin, Maryland on the Eastern Shore for her leadership of the Corps Cadets and for also being such a great moderator today. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Admiral.